It began 3 weeks ago, with a sound so mundane it was almost offensive. Knock, knock, knock. 3 precise measured raps on my front door. It was 2:17 a.m. I know because my eyes snapped open from a dead sleep, and the first thing I saw was the blood-red numbers of my alarm clock burning into the darkness. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in the cage of my ribs. Who the hell knocks on a door at 2:17 in the morning? I lay there, frozen. The silence after the knocks somehow louder and more menacing than the sound itself. I strained my ears, listening for the crunch of gravel on my driveway, the sound of a car engine starting, a retreating footstep. Nothing. Just the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the frantic thumping of my own pulse in my ears. After 10 minutes of paralyzing silence, I crept out of bed, my legs feeling like wet sandbags. I moved to the window that overlooked the front porch, peeling back the corner of the blind just enough to peer out. The porch light was off, and the motion sensor floodlight hadn't been triggered. The small circle of illumination from the street lamp at the end of my long driveway showed nothing. No car, no figure, no shadow. Just an empty, sleeping suburban street. I chalked it up to a prank. Kids probably. Bored teenagers getting their kicks by scaring the lone guy in the old house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Annoying, but harmless. I went back to bed, but sleep was a distant country. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of a branch against the siding, was the prelude to another set of knocks. The next night, it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. 2:17 a.m. exactly. This time, the fear was colder, sharper. It wasn't random. It was scheduled. I didn't even bother getting out of bed. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the oppressive silence that followed. The knocks weren't loud or aggressive. They were polite, firm, but patient, as if the person on the other side had all the time in the world and was simply waiting for me to catch up. The third night, I was ready. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the armchair in my living room, in the dark, a baseball bat leaning against my leg, and stared at the faint outline of the front door. The digital clock on the DVD player glowed 2:10, 2:12, 2:15. My hands were slick with sweat. The house was so quiet, I could hear the faint buzz of the electricity in the walls. 2:16. I held my breath. 2:17. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was clear, resonant, and it came from the other side of the wood, no more than 5 feet from where I sat. I jerked back in the chair, my heart seizing in my chest. I hadn't heard a single approach, no footsteps on the porch, no creak of the wooden steps. It was as if the knocker had simply materialized at my door. I gripped the baseball bat, my knuckles white. I wanted to scream, "Who's there?" I wanted to fling the door open and confront the little shits who were terrorizing me. But a deeper, more primal instinct held me frozen. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. A prankster makes noise. A prankster runs away laughing. This was a ritual. I sat there until the sky began to lighten to a dull grey, the bat still in my hands, the memory of those 3 knocks echoing in the silent house. And so, it became my new reality. Every night at 2:17 a.m., the stranger would come and deliver 3 knocks. I stopped sleeping through the night. I'd nap in the early evening, then be wide awake by 1 a.m., a sentinel awaiting the inevitable. I tried everything. I set up a cheap Wi-Fi camera on a bookshelf, pointing at the door. The next night, at 2:17, I watched the live feed on my phone. The knocks came. The camera showed nothing but the static image of my closed door. No shadow, no distortion. Just 3 knocks from an empty porch. I called the police after the first week. 2 officers came, polite but visibly bored. I told them about the knocks, the time, the silence. They took notes. One of them, an older cop with tired eyes, walked the perimeter of my house. "Motion lights working," he said, pointing to the floodlight over the garage. "No footprints I can see." "You said you didn't see anyone on your camera." "Nothing," I said, my voice tight with a frustration that was edging into desperation. He gave me a look that was part pity, part skepticism. "Mr. Dan, it's a quiet neighborhood. We'll add a patrol car to the loop, but sometimes, with these older houses, the pipes can make some funny noises, or it could be an animal, a raccoon knocking over a pot, something like that." "It's not a raccoon," I said through gritted teeth. "It's 3 knocks, always 3, always at the same time." He just nodded, and they left. I felt foolish and utterly alone. The knocks continued their relentless nightly schedule. They began to change me. I was a ghost in my own life. I stopped going to the gym, stopped seeing friends. My work, which I did remotely as a freelance graphic designer, began to suffer. Colors and shapes on the screen seemed meaningless, when all my mind could focus on was the slow, inevitable crawl of the clock towards 2:17 a.m. I started researching folklore, urban legends, anything about nocturnal visitations or triple knocks. I fell down rabbit holes of superstition. In some cultures, a single knock is an omen. 3 knocks can be a mockery of the Holy Trinity, a sign of a demonic presence. I read stories about the 3 knocks phenomenon, about entities that gain power by being acknowledged. My search history was a map of my own descent into paranoia. The lack of sleep was eroding my sanity. I saw things in the periphery of my vision, a flicker of movement in a dark hallway, a shape standing just outside a window. I'd spin around, and there would be nothing. The house felt different, heavier, as if the air itself was thickening, becoming saturated with a silent, watching presence. The stranger wasn't just knocking on the door anymore. It was knocking on the edges of my mind. Last night, something shifted. The day had been worse than usual. A migraine had clamped its vice around my skull since morning, and a pervasive sense of dread had followed me from room to room. I felt like an animal in a trap, chewing its own leg off, knowing the hunter was coming at nightfall. As I sat in my living room armchair, the familiar vigil beginning, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't spend another night listening to that polite, patient, world-ending sound. The fear, which had been a cold stone in my gut for weeks, suddenly ignited into a white-hot fury. This was my house, my life, and it was being stolen from me, 3 knocks at a time. 2:10 a.m. The rage was a fire in my veins, burning away the fatigue and the fear. I was done being a victim in my own home. 2:15 a.m. I stood up from the chair, my body trembling not with terror, but with a kind of frantic, desperate energy. The baseball bat felt like a toy in my hands. I needed something else. I marched into the kitchen and yanked a drawer open, pulling out the heaviest, most brutal-looking knife I owned. The steel gleamed dully in the gloom. 2:16 a.m. I walked to the front door and stood before it, knife held tight in my sweaty fist. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, listening. Nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own ragged breathing. 2:17 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was right there, inches from my face. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, panicked drum. The fury and the fear were at war inside me, a screaming tempest. This was it, the end of something. With a guttural yell that tore from my throat, I reached out with my free hand, my fingers closing around the cold brass of the deadbolt. I twisted it. The sound was obscenely loud in the silence. I turned the doorknob and, with all my strength, I wrenched the door open. The porch was empty. The thought, "Of course it is," flashed through my mind. A final, pathetic surrender. But then, I looked down. There, on the welcome mat, a mat my mother had given me that read, "Go away," was a small, black box. It was about the size of a ring box, made of a material that seemed to swallow the faint light from the street lamp, utterly non-reflective. It was just a void in the shape of a cube. The air on my porch was deathly cold, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. It was the cold of a tomb, of a place the sun has never touched. And then I saw him, not on the porch, but at the very edge of my property line, where my lawn met the street. He was standing perfectly still under the glow of the street lamp. He was tall and impossibly thin, dressed in a black, form-fitting suit that seemed to ripple and shift, even though there was no wind. His limbs were too long, his posture a broken, unnatural angle, like a spider standing on its hind legs. His face was a pale, featureless oval, devoid of eyes, a nose, a mouth. Just smooth, blank skin. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, into my house, into the life I had built there. Terror, pure and undiluted, flooded my system, freezing the rage in its tracks. This was no teenager. This was no hallucination. This was something else, something that did not belong in this world. My gaze was locked on him, my body rigid with a fear so absolute it was almost peaceful. This was the end. He would now walk towards me, his two long limbs moving in a jerky, horrifying gait, and he would take me. But he didn't move. Instead, he slowly, deliberately raised one of his long, spidery arms. He didn't point at me. He pointed at the box on my welcome mat. Then, he was gone. Not like he vanished in a puff of smoke, but like he was never there to begin with. The space under the street lamp was just empty. I stood there in the open doorway, the cold air spilling into my house, for what felt like an eternity. My mind was screaming, a cacophony of primal warnings. Don't touch it. Slam the door. Run. But another part, a part that had been worn down by weeks of psychological torture, was compelled. This was an answer. This was the reason. The stranger had finally delivered his message. Hesitantly, my knife still clutched in one hand, I bent down. I reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the box. It was lighter than I expected, almost weightless, and it was cold. A cold that seeped into my skin and bone. I brought it inside, my movements robotic. I kicked the door shut with my foot, not taking my eyes off the small black cube in my hand. I backed into the living room and collapsed into my armchair, placing the box on the coffee table. It sat there, a little pocket of absolute darkness in the middle of my normal living room. It looked wrong. It felt wrong. It was an intrusion, a glitch in reality. What was inside? A finger, a worm, a key, a note that said, "Game over." There was no seam, no hinge, no latch. It was a perfect, seamless cube. I turned it over in my hands, the coldness numbing my fingers. How did you open it? As if in response to my thought, I felt a tiny, almost imperceptible vibration. A hairline crack appeared on the top of the box. Then, with a soft, sighing sound, the top of the cube split into 4 triangular segments and folded back, like a flower blooming in fast forward. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like black velvet, was a small, intricately carved bone whistle. It was yellowed with age, covered in tiny, spiraling patterns that seemed to move and shift if I didn't look at them directly. Next to the whistle was a slip of parchment. The writing on it was in a rusty brown ink that I desperately hoped was not blood. It was a single, elegantly scripted sentence. "Play it, and you will see what follows." My blood ran colder than the box. This was it, the choice, the final test. Every horror story, every folktale, every instinct I possessed screamed at me not to do it. To throw the whistle into the fireplace, to smash it with a hammer, to bury it in the backyard, but I was so tired, and I had to know. After weeks of torment, of having my reality systematically dismantled, I needed to know what was on the other side of that door. What was so important that it required this elaborate, nightly ritual? With a shaking hand, I picked up the whistle. It was warm, a shocking contrast to the icy box. The bone felt porous, alive almost. I brought it to my lips. My heart was a trip hammer in my chest. This was the point of no return. I knew it in my soul. I took a shallow, ragged breath and blew. The sound that came out was not a sound. It was a feeling, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated not through the air, but through the very fabric of the space around me. It was a note of absolute nullity, the audio equivalent of the color black. It made no noise, yet it filled the room, pressing in on my eardrums, making my teeth ache. The moment the silent note ended, the world changed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The hum of the refrigerator was gone. The faint, distant sound of the highway a mile away was gone. The world outside my windows was utterly, profoundly silent. It was the silence of a vacuum, of deep space. Then, the light began to drain from the room, not like a sunset, but like a liquid being siphoned away. The colors leached out of everything. The deep red of my sofa faded to a dull gray. The green of a plant on the bookshelf turned ashen. Soon, I was sitting in a world of grayscale. I stood up, the whistle falling from my numb fingers and clattering onto the coffee table. The sound was flat and dead. I stumbled to the front window and looked out. My street was gone. In its place was a vast grey plain under a sky the colour of a dirty bruise. There was no sun, no moon, no stars. Just a uniform, oppressive gloom. The houses of my neighbours were vague, crumbling shapes in the distance, like ancient ruins. The trees were skeletal, black things that stood motionless in the stagnant air. This wasn't my world. This was some reflection, a negative image, a waiting room, and I was not alone. Figures began to appear. They didn't walk out from behind the ruined houses. They simply coalesced from the grey, forming out of the gloom itself. They were humanoid, but wrong. Their proportions were off. Some had limbs that dragged on the ground. Others had heads that lolled on necks too thin to support them. They were shades, silhouettes of people, but they carried a weight of profound sadness and malevolence that pressed against my soul. They started moving towards my house, not running, not even walking with purpose. They drifted, their forms shifting and blurring at the edges. There was no expression on their featureless faces, but I could feel their attention. They were hungry, and my house, my presence, was a beacon in this desolate place. A soft, scraping sound came from the front door. I backed away from the window, my breath catching in my throat. The scraping came again, slow, deliberate, like a fingernail being dragged down the length of the wood. Then, a whisper. It wasn't a voice I heard with my ears, but one that was planted directly into my mind. It was dry, like the rustling of dead leaves. "You let us in." Panic seized me. I spun around, looking for an escape. The back door. I had to get to the back door. I ran through the grayscale kitchen, my movements sluggish, as if I were running through water. I grabbed the handle of the back door and yanked it open. The grey plain stretched out endlessly behind my house, identical to the front, and more of the shapes were there, drifting closer. Hundreds of them. An endless procession of the lost and the hungry. "You opened the door," the whisper came again, this time from multiple directions at once. "You played the call. You are the gate now." I slammed the back door shut and fumbled for the deadbolt, but my fingers were numb and clumsy. The scraping started on the back door now, accompanied by a gentle, persistent knocking. Knock, knock, knock. It was the same rhythm, the same sound that had started this nightmare. But now it was coming from every window, every door. It was a symphony of knocking, a percussive death rattle surrounding my home. I ran back into the living room, my mind fracturing. The shapes were at the windows now, pressing their blank faces against the glass. The panes were beginning to frost over from their touch, a creeping, crystalline pattern of cold. The black box was still on the coffee table, its lid open. The bone whistle lay beside it. That was the key. I had to undo it. I had to reverse it. I snatched up the whistle and brought it to my lips again. I blew with all the air left in my burning lungs. The same silent, null frequency vibrated through the house. For a single, heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The knocking continued. The frost spread across the windows. Then, the world lurched. The color flooded back into the room so violently, it hurt my eyes. The red of the sofa was a shocking crimson. The sound of the refrigerator kicking in was a deafening roar. The knocking stopped. I gasped, staggering, and fell to my knees. I was back. I was in my world. I could hear a car passing on the street outside. I was safe. Tears of relief streamed down my face. I laughed, a broken, hysterical sound. I had done it. I had broken the spell. That's when I noticed the smell, a faint, coppery odor, like old blood and damp earth. And the temperature. It was still cold. Not the chill of the grave from the porch, but a persistent, localized cold that seemed to emanate from the corner of the living room. I looked up. He was there. The stranger. The tall, thin man in the black suit. He was inside my house. He stood in the shadows by the bookcase, his featureless face turned towards me. He was no longer a distant spectre under a street lamp. He was here, in my sanctuary. He had followed me back. He didn't move. He just stood there, a monument of silent observation. His presence was a physical weight, a pressure in the room that made it hard to breathe. The whistle hadn't closed the door. It had just changed the locks. He wasn't outside knocking anymore. He was inside, waiting. I don't know how long I knelt there staring at him. Time lost all meaning. He never moved, never made a sound, but I could feel his attention like a physical touch, cold and invasive. Slowly, shakily, I got to my feet. My eyes never left him. I backed away, step by agonizing step, until I felt the banister of the stairs against my back. I then turned and fled up to my bedroom, slamming the door and shoving a chair under the knob. I am in here now. It's 4:38 in the morning. The sun will be up soon, but I don't think it will make a difference. I can feel him down there, a cold spot in the heart of my home. The knocks have stopped for good. I know that much. He doesn't need to knock anymore. He's already in. And last night, as I lay trembling in my bed, I heard a new sound. It was a soft, shuffling footstep at the bottom of the stairs. Then another, and another. He's coming up. The 3 knocks were never a threat. They were an invitation. And last night, I answered.